Hello, and welcome to a special episode of The Angry Astronaut. Special in a way that, well, I'd just say that I'd prefer not to be making this episode, to be honest, because in the year that I've been running this channel, I have never gone after another creator. I have never gone after somebody else's work and criticized it. It's just not something that I think that most creators should do, unless the content of the channel involved is just so horrible or so misleading or so damaging that it should be called out. And that's why I'm doing this. So, this individual, I'm not going to mention what his channel is. I'm going to be very vague when I'm talking about what he calls himself. However, I do need to use the words common sense, which is going to make it pretty easy to find him. So, hey, guess what, guy? I'm giving you a lot of free publicity. So, regardless of what I have to say after this, you're getting much more positive out of this than negative. But nevertheless, I feel that I have to say something. After watching his content one video after another, I found a little bit of information that was accurate, a little bit in the ways of, criticizing Elon Musk's claims and plans that are completely valid. However, it is very much in the minority. The vast majority of this content is either misleading if you take some effort to look into the mathematics behind it, or just simply the common sense. And some of it is absolutely insane. And I just got tired of it. I'm sick of watching things like this. And since I think anybody who watches my channel knows that I don't take Elon at his word, like a fanatic or anything like that I've criticized some of his plans myself, in many regards, especially the landing of the Starship and things like that. I think that I might be a good person to actually go after this person, simply because I'm okay with criticizing the Starship or criticizing Elon Musk's plans. I think that anything that Elon does should be open to criticism, because constructive criticism can make things better. But this is not constructive criticism. It's not accurate criticism. It's sensationalism for the sake of getting those sweet views, and that's just about it. And if I could ask a favor of the people who watch this, don't go over to that channel. Just don't. And please don't leave comments either. The more comments that you leave there, the more the algorithm is going to help that channel. And he's been in a strong growth mode already. Now, of course, a lot of you aren't going to listen. You're going to be curious. You're going to go over there and all that. That's fine. I can't stop you. But at the same time, if you don't want to help him, just don't go over there. And also, don't drown him in a ton of thumbs down. That's not the way to debunk somebody, is to have a whole bunch of dislikes. Instead, it's better to debunk somebody with reason and, dare I say it, common sense. So here we go right now. Now, the first thing that our common sense guy goes after is Starship design and capacity. And although I agree with one aspect with what he has to say, the rest of it is complete nonsense. By the end of most of his videos, he would have you believing that stepping foot on the Starship and making your way to the Red Planet would be the equivalent of taking a ride across the river Styx. And I'll tell you, it's not going to even be remotely like that. However, let's at least get to the point where he's right. One of Elon's primary claims is that the Starship is going to be able to carry 100 passengers, and Mr. Common Sense says that given the rather vague interior diagrams that we've been provided so far, there's no way that the Starship's interior fairing would be able to handle this many passengers, and in my opinion, he's correct. But it's the numbers that he uses to come to this conclusion that I find to be the most annoying. So let's have a look at them for a few moments. Turns out Common Sense Guy is wrong on his first number, estimating the weight of a colonist at 200 pounds per person. I guess we're only going to be taking men to Mars because the weight of the average female in the United States is around 170 pounds, and the United States is notorious for having unhealthy people. Now, this isn't fat shaming. I'm 25 pounds overweight myself, but the fact of the matter is, colonists going to Mars are going to have to be at their peak of physical condition, and the average weight is probably going to be closer to the average weight of males and females in Europe, which is 156 pounds per person. Now keep in mind, colonists are going to have to do 2 hours of physical exercise every single day that they're on the Starship, which means they're going to have to be in good enough shape to do that before they step on board. So there just isn't going to be a lot of body fat on these people. It's not a matter of prejudice, it's a matter of necessity. And speaking of weight, now we need to move on to food. And here, Common Sense Guy is just as misleading. He talks about the weight of astronaut meals, how many they eat per day, and the requirement of 9 months worth of supplies. Although we all know that the amount of time that the Starship will require to get from Earth to Mars is 6 months, not 9. So by his calculations, 9 months worth of food at 3 meals a day comes to 148,230 pounds. Plus he loves to talk about the expense of that food. But is that really the case? You see, Common Sense Guy assumes that it's going to take 9 months to get to Mars because every previous mission has taken an average of that time. But all of those missions had to overcome all of Earth's gravity, plus everything else in terms of delta V to get to Mars, whereas the Starship only has to overcome the delta V to get from here to here. And this is just 1/3 the delta V needed to get into low Earth orbit. And the reason the Starship has this luxury is because of orbital refueling, which this guy doesn't believe in either, which gives the Starship the luxury of conquering a lot less delta V to get to Mars than any previous mission, therefore allowing it to burn more fuel to get to the destination faster, namely about 6 months. And this one factor throws all of his figures into question. If you reduce the water, food, and other consumables by 1/3, then the 121,000 pounds worth of overweight that he claims the Starship is going to have virtually evaporates. However, I did say that I agree with him that 100 people is too many. However, a more reasonable group, like 50, easily falls within the 100 metric ton requirements of the Starship. However, even this conservative number isn't enough to satisfy this guy. Based on a rather arbitrary amount of cubic meters required per crewman set by NASA, he says that 17 people is the maximum number that the Starship could carry. Were that the case, This vessel would have never sailed to win the Battle of Trafalgar. Carrying a crew of over 800, this ship allowed each crewman one hammock of 6 feet by 3 feet with 14 inches worth of space to sleep in, or 28 inches for petty officers. Granted, 50 people in the Starship fairing will be kind of cramped, but nothing like this. However, this fellow would have us believe that comparing space travel to travel on a 19th century man of war is an unfair comparison, that traveling on a sailing ship was an idyllic experience with the sun on your face and the salt wind in your nostrils, whereas traveling through space is a journey through hell. However, what he fails to mention is things like smallpox and malaria and other diseases that these people didn't understand that completely decimated the crews of these ships. The food on these vessels was so rotten and the water was so rank that it compelled British seamen to drink large amounts of rum simply because the water was impossible or oftentimes too poisoned to drink. Just read the account of a colorful fellow named Jack Nastyface and you'll agree that a 6-month journey on the Starship would be a cakewalk compared to serving on a British warship. And although, in theory, an environment of microgravity makes human beings more vulnerable to diseases that are hiding inside them, things like shingles and mononucleosis, thus far, all of the astronauts who have served aboard the ISS, and there have been quite a few of them, have never experienced any of these consequences. In my opinion, this danger may be a bit overblown. And if you want to talk about the rigors of microgravity, this is Christina Koch after almost 1 year on the ISS, and this is about 24 hours after she landed in Kazakhstan. Granted, she's probably in some pain, but she's able to stand on her feet in 1 g of Earth gravity. Martian colonists would only have to endure 1/3 of that. Granted, there would probably be a protocol involved where they would relax inside the ship for about a day after arrival, slowly getting adjusted to 1/3 gravity as they begin to assume their duties. But nevertheless, as you can see, Christina is handling the adjustment quite well. And by the way, I watched other videos of her playing with her dogs a few hours after this video was shot. Now, as far as interplanetary radiation and cosmic rays are concerned, this is definitely something to be worried about and not to be taken lightly. And I don't think, in spite of what Common Sense Guy says, that Elon is going to take it lightly and put no protection on the ship whatsoever, especially since he's going to have an awful lot of data from the Lunar Gateway that is specifically designed, among many other things, to test protection for astronauts against interplanetary radiation and cosmic rays. Once he's gathered the data from this station, he's going to be a lot better prepared to protect the Starship against the dangers that are in interplanetary space. I don't think he has any desire to see his colonists die of radiation poisoning or cancer or something along those lines a few years after they arrive at Mars. But this is kind of Common Sense Guy's MO. In general, he makes thinly veiled accusations that Elon Musk is either incompetent, stupid, crazy, or just simply disregards the safety of those who are going to be flying on the Starship. I'll give you an example of this. The first example is an alleged design flaw with the Starship itself. According to this guy, the tanks themselves do not have the stability or the resilience to handle the pressure, and whereas it is true that SN8 was only partially fueled when it went up on its test flight, it was tested to industry standards to failure with full tanks multiple times before it even did its static fires. Now, one of the most recent pieces of proof, quote unquote, of the structural instability of the Starship is a frame by frame analysis of the crash of SN8. And yes, the cameras were switched at the last moment, but our friend had access to a number of other cameras and did an analysis that he says shows the Starship buckling. But the fact of the matter is the Starship was descending at 30 meters per second too fast for a landing. Any stainless steel or any other kind of structure that heavy impacting the ground at that speed would simply shatter. Anything would buckle under that kind of impact, regardless of what it was made out of. So it's not really proof, just a lot of sensationalistic fear. I mean, I can't count the number of times that this guy claims that Elon Musk and his plans are going to kill us all, and one of these examples is feeding a colony of 1 million people. And the example he uses is, yeah, you're looking at it right now, wheat. Using wheat to support a Martian colony, perhaps one of the most inefficient ways that I could think of feeding a colony of 1 million people with today's technology. Now, granted, bread has been feeding much of the human civilization for a very long time. However, it's just not an efficient type of thing to grow on Mars. You need so many other things that you don't have on Mars in order to produce bread or whatever else you'd want to get out of wheat. So he provides these mathematical figures of how much acreage you would need, the kind of domes you would need to construct, and henceforth says that it's impossible. I'm not going to get into the details. And the reason that I'm not going to get into the details is because there's so many different ways that you can grow enormous amounts of food on a much smaller plot of acreage, far more efficiently using modern technology. Aquaponics happens to be my favorite. 1 acre of an aquaponic system can produce 200,000 pounds of food per year. Now, using statistics gathered from charitable organizations across the globe who advocate the use of this technology, it requires about 4 pounds per day for a human being to survive. And this is a combination of vegetables, fruits like blueberries and such, which can be grown with this system, and also tilapia, fish being included in the system. So, doing some quick math and using today's technology, each acre could feed 137 colonists. Now granted, that's not 1 million people, but what it does mean is that each Starship could have a 3/4 of an acre dome of aquaponics assigned to them, and that would be sufficient to sustain them forever. Or you could increase the size of the dome, obviously, for larger populations. And what would you make the dome out of? Well, you've heard me mention this before, silica aerogel. And this is something that could be easily constructed on Mars simply because its crust has a lot of silicon in it, just like Earth's crust does. So, what would we be looking at total for 1 million people? Well, crunching the numbers, you come up with a total of 7,900 acres, or roughly 12.34 square miles. Now, granted, that is a lot of territory, but once again, we're talking about 1 million people here, and you wouldn't have to have it under one gigantic dome as depicted here. It could be under a whole bunch of small ones. As I said, each Starship having its own dome. That would reduce the chances of failure in any event in case there is some sort of breach or terrorist attack or something along those lines. Now, by way of comparison, this guy's wheat system requires 31,000 acres worth of space for 1 loaf of bread per week, which might sound good to a civilian during the siege of Leningrad, but awful otherwise. And instead of this hellish diet, aquaponics would provide a completely balanced diet for the Martian colonists for as long as they might live on Mars. And you don't need nitrogen fertilizer either. The fish do the fertilizing for you, and you can transport the fish in egg form because they only hatch at a certain temperature. I have a video about this particular subject linked in the description. And oh, yeah, speaking of food, when it comes to food on the Starship, this is where this guy's mathematics get ridiculous and downright misleading. He quotes a price of $18,300 per meal based on the current cost per kilogram of getting food into orbit. It's not like the Starship is going to have a separate supply ship, like a Cygnus, for example, supplying it with food. It's going to bring the food with them. And it gets even more ridiculous in another video when he claims that a fleet with 1 million colonists would be consuming trillions of dollars worth of food during their journey because of the insane cost per meal. But this is based on a cost per kilogram that has nothing to do with the Starship. He should know this. I think he does know this, and he's intentionally trying to mislead people for the sake of his argument. However, it's the misinformation that leads people to believe that Starship is going to kill us all that annoys me the most. And the craziest calculation that this guy has ever done is coming up. Now, I assure you, I'm not making this up. According to this guy, he crunched some numbers as to the total BTUs that would be created by all of the fuel in the Super Heavy and the Starship should, God forbid, the whole thing explode on the pad, and he estimates that it would cause an explosion the equivalent of several Hiroshima bombs. He then goes on to estimate what such an explosion would do in some of the more populated areas of the world, or even in Boca Chica, for example. And I assure you, even though this is a very frightening prospect, and the Super Heavy and the Starship blowing up on the pad would create a hell of an explosion, the notion that it would be a nuclear-sized explosion is a complete load of And the reason this gets me so angry is because of what happened to the Soviet N-1. Now, although this rocket, which carried about a little more than half the fuel of the Starship and the Super Heavy combined, produced a very large explosion, it was later determined to be a kiloton at most, simply because rocket fuel doesn't explode like a nuclear blast. Instead, the majority of it simply burns up like the Hindenburg. And although I'd certainly want to be several miles away from the Starship when it first took off, I assure you it would produce nothing like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. To even suggest such a thing is irresponsible and disrespectful to the victims of those explosions. Not only that, it's just sensationalistic, like a lot of what this guy says, and that is why this video had to be made. Now, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I was not enthusiastic about doing this to begin with. As I say, don't like going after somebody else's content. People work very hard on their YouTube channels in order to make them successful. I myself have taken, of course, a very different approach to a space channel by editorializing and criticizing companies and ideas that I don't think are good, that sort of thing, in order to differentiate myself. But also, I'm being honest about my opinions, and I do my very best to back them up. And if I don't think that they're scientifically sound, then there's no way in hell that I'm going to say it. But to claim that the Starship is going to produce the force of several Hiroshima bombs if it blows up on the pad, that's simple insanity. And anybody who knows anything about science, and I don't think that this guy is nuts or stupid or anything like that. Anybody who knows anything about nuclear weapons, as you saw in the video, knows that this is simply not true. When the N1 blew up, it was nowhere near as powerful as a nuclear explosion. And it was a huge explosion. And you know what? Is the Starship going to be thousands of N1s? Of course it isn't. And of course, you saw in the video. And this is just one of several examples of just bad mathematics, bad reasoning, and just sometimes just things that are flat out crazy. And I decided that there might be people who actually listen. There might be people who actually believe all of this stuff. And I really wanted to try to nip it in the bud with a little bit of common sense. So, in any event, I'm going to end things right now because I spent enough time debunking as many things as I possibly could about what this guy is doing. I'm sure he's going to have some sort of reaction, or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll ignore me. It's hard to say. But regardless, until we have debunked every notion that colonizing Mars is an impossible thing, and that establishing a second home for the human species, which is absolutely essential to our survival, is an impossible thing, until we dismiss that idea completely, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.